So my introduction will be very brief because we're going to let Rajan speak. So why underdevelopment? Why is democracy not necessarily a remedy to underdevelopment? And why do we have inefficient and unjust institutions also in developed countries? What influences the free market and how free is the market? As many open questions to which our guest will respond. We're talking about Rajan, who actually identifies essentially two obstacles. First of all, the power of economic elites, that is to say monopolistic groups which distort competition and prevent other subjects or players from competing. And this is an aspect which has already been discussed by Rajan in a successful book published in Italy and written together with Luigi Zengales. And the title of the book itself is stimulating, that is to say, saving capitalism from capitalists. So starting from here, Rajan has further developed his theory, and he has found out that, well, there is a constant obstacle, or rather two constant obstacles. On the one hand, the elites, the economic elites, the social classes, and then on the other hand, the different needs of other classes, of the middle classes, for instance, which should not have the same needs, interests, and expectations of reform as the poorer classes. And Rajan will explain that this is something which crosses all frontiers. It is found throughout the world, in Asia, Africa, America.
If you want, you can start.
Thank you very much. Thanks for coming here. And let me explain very briefly what I want to talk about, then walk you through some slides. I will actually present a model, but I'll make it absolutely crystal clear, and it won't have any Greek letters. It won't be Greek economics as Paul Krugman defined yesterday. What I want to talk about is actually the underlying thesis behind our discussion today here. Is it true that democracy leads necessarily to the development of strong markets and to economic growth? Or more generally, does development in political institutions create the underlying conditions for economic growth? Or is it possible to have paralysis in democracies? And what might that paralysis be caused by? And how do you sort of unfreeze countries? And clearly, this is an issue which is of importance in this country, in Italy. It's an issue of importance in my country, India, where there is a constant discussion about whether there is a discount for democracy in India, and as a result, India is held back. But it's also a discussion which becomes very relevant when we look at the fact that over the last 30 or 40 years, we've had a tremendous development in political conditions. Across the world, a number of countries have become independent. A large number of countries have become democracies from being dictatorships and authoritarian before. And yet, there is a sense of disappointment, certainly in a number of countries in Africa, but also in Latin America and sometimes even in Asia, that these political developments haven't paid off as much in terms of economic growth. And I will argue that the reason is not so much that democracy is detrimental for growth. I certainly don't want to make that argument. But it may well be that there are other conditions which are also necessary to create the atmosphere for good policies to be enacted. And the fact is that many of these countries that have become independent without those underlying conditions. And as a result, they can get trapped in dysfunctional politics. And to some extent, the way out sometimes seems to be to get the politics to get aligned and that means changes on a number of other dimensions than the political institutions. Put differently, I want to argue that a lot of the time, people look at their own countries when it's not growing and say, this is because it has a presidential form of government. People in other countries say, this is because we have a parliamentary form of government. Sometimes they complain about proportional representation. Sometimes they complain about majoritarian rule. People complain about political institutions a lot of the time. But I think in reality, the political institutions are, to my mind, reflective and sometimes second order to the underlying conditions in society. And I want to talk specifically about those conditions, which I will define largely in terms of inequality of various kinds of endowments. And those create frictions within society. Of course, this is just one view of the growth process, and I'd be happy to talk about more as we go on. So let me, with that preamble, let me talk about some of the reasons people argue for why underdevelopment is so persistent. A lot of recent theories focus on the fact that in many of the countries which stay underdeveloped, there are strong elite groups. Sometimes the elite are landowners, sometimes they are a very powerful group in the middle class. But essentially the idea is, here are people who enjoy certain benefits from the status quo, and they get a big share of what is a small pie. And their fear about letting the pie grow is that in that process, their share will fall disproportionately. And it may be that on net, they're worse off by letting the pie grow, so they maintain policies that actually keep the pie small rather than allowing the pie to get bigger. Now, often it's argued that these people are enabled to maintain these policies because they have political power. Either they control the army, or they control political institutions, or political institutions are skewed to give them disproportionate power. Their voting rights are skewed such that this group continuously maintains power. But to some extent, economists would argue, well, aren't we looking in the wrong place? If in fact they had all the power, wouldn't it make sense for them to allow for more growth and then tax the growth so that they maintain their share? In other words, let people do the right thing, but then expropriate them by taxing them. Of course, taxation has some negative effects on growth, but if you could do that, wouldn't that be better than keeping the pie really small? So is it really that people have disproportionate power, or is it something else? I also want to argue that this notion that the elite have power and therefore have disproportionate political power and therefore can keep the pie continuously small is not consistent with some of the facts that you see even in developing countries. For example, in India, for a long time, certainly till the late 1980s, we had totally dysfunctional economic policies which tended to preserve a relatively small elite of businessmen and large landlords. And, the question here was, why was it the case here? Why was it that somehow people could maintain these groups in power, despite the fact that democracy in India was quite vibrant? And you just have to travel to India during an election to see that there are no holes barred. Everything can be questioned. It's just like democracy everywhere else. And my view and you can repeat this argument for countries in Africa and elsewhere, why is it that post-independence policies change so little? Why is it that post-democratization policies change so little? They keep continuing the same set of policies. It's not that things change that much. Why is that the case? And to my mind, it's not so much that democracy is subverted in the sense that people don't have votes, but really it is that we feel the world is divided into two groups, the elite and the rest. And that when we have democracy, the rest will decide, it's now time for us to get rid of those old policies, and we will have new policies that benefit all. The truth is, the rest are not one whole. The rest are very divided. And they have very different views on the kinds of policies that can benefit themselves. And it is this fractionalization of the rest which prevents you from actually changing the status quo. It's very easy for the status quo to persist despite a change in the underlying political conditions, simply because the status quo has enough support even amongst the oppressed. And I will give you some examples of this. But let me give you a quick example just to fix ideas. Think about what is happening in China. One of the things that's happening in China is tremendous growth in the coastal areas. And you would argue, well, there's tremendous growth in the country, it's spilling over to the rest of the country, people should be very happy about this. But the Chinese authorities are extremely worried about the unequal growth. Why? Because they hear it from the people. The people are saying, especially the people in the interior areas, what have we benefited from economic growth? We continued farming the same farms. But earlier we used to get subsidized education. Now the price of education has gone up. We have to pay fees. And the teachers are no longer as good because the good teachers have gone to the coastal areas to work. On healthcare, we used to have the barefoot doctors. We used to have a reasonable healthcare system. Now the healthcare system is totally broken down, and if we can get to see a doctor, we have to pay an arm and a leg to get them to actually treat us. And again, the reason is because the coastal areas are flourishing. Anybody who's any good at offering medicine has gone to the coastal areas, increasing the cost for all of us. So what I'm arguing is unequal change, unequal development. Comes from the fact that, in part, the interior areas are not as suitable for the export-oriented growth that China has. In part, many of the people in the interior areas are uneducated, they're farmers, they can't benefit from the growth processes that are taking China forward. And as a result, they don't benefit as much from the opportunities, but the opportunities that others are having starts costing them a fair amount because it comes back through the price of grain, through the price of medical care, through the price of education. And so what you have is, in a society which is divided, which faces substantial new opportunities, there can be substantial dissension about whether in fact we should seize these opportunities. Now China hasn't slowed down in its growth because still the leadership is not as, doesn't listen as much to the democratic public as in a democracy. But I can tell you in India, these inequalities which are emerging are becoming a big source of concern and are causing a political reaction within the country which can, in the future, hold back policy reform and essentially hold back growth. So the basic point I'm trying to make is it's not democracy itself which is a problem, it is the underlying conditions of access, of inequality, which can work towards reducing growth. And I will talk about that, and that really is the point I want to make with some examples in what follows. So where does this inequality come from? I think in major ways, the inequality comes from an inequality in endowment. People who are differentially educated, for example, have a different ability to take advantage of the opportunities that come into the economy. For example, as a caricature in India, everybody talks about the software economy, about these wonderful Indian professionals. Well, that segment of the economy is about 2 million people out of an economy of over 1 billion people. So 1/50th, actually 1/500th of the economy is benefiting from these opportunities. And the larger part of the Indian economy, still a significant portion is illiterate, can't actually read. A significant portion is very poorly schooled. The very few elite that you see have been schooled in the best universities. Those universities take at most 25,000, 30,000 people. This notion that there are millions of engineers waiting to take jobs from the West in India is complete bogus. It's pure, utter nonsense. When you look at the universities in India, the good ones that are on par with the university here, you will find at most 35,000, 40,000 students being produced every year. It's a drop in the ocean. But the rest of the economy doesn't benefit from this kind of growth, and there is a reaction coming in, a reaction setting in. These are the people who pay high grain prices today. These are the people who are saying, where is all that growth going? We're not getting any of it. And so the point I want to make is that when you have these unequal endowments, and the voice of this unequal endowment can get expressed through a democratic process, it can lead to less of a consensus for growth. Essentially, what I'm talking about is society is divided. Society is divided because people have different endowments, whether it be of land or of education, and people who have different endowments see reforms very differently. What I see depends on where I stand, and where I stand is different because I have different endowments. And it can be that no reform path commands majority support, as a result of which the status quo can continue for some time. Of course, there are things that break the status quo, that has helped break it in India, broken it in India, but by and large, the result of this tremendous inequality is of a very bad status quo, which can be problematic. So I want to give you a very quick example, and I want to tell you what goes behind the Greek letters in an economic model. So some of you who've seen economic models from far, let me give you a quick verbal model of what I have in mind, and you tell me whether it rings true. Think of a country with just one monopolist firm. This is the sole capitalist, and he employs everybody else. And the economy has educated people. The educated people can work as managers for this firm, or they can work as doctors in the economy. And let's assume that everybody has to go and get services from this doctor. And then there are the uneducated poor who can work only as laborers for this firm. They don't have other employment opportunities. So essentially we have three groups in this country. We have the capitalist, we have the middle class educated, and we have the lower class uneducated. And let's assume that each one has one vote, and you need 2 out of 3 votes to win. So this is an imperfect democracy where money matters. So the capitalist who has a lot of money, even though he has only 1 vote, can sway public opinion. So he has a fair amount of power. But he doesn't have absolute power. This is not an autocratic system. It's a democracy. And you need 2 out of 3 votes to actually get consensus on reforms. And let's talk about 2 reforms which seem completely obvious reforms in any country. One is to have universal education. And let's assume for now that there are no costs. Usually when you have cost to education, you can complain about who will bear the cost and you could get dissension. Let's assume it's free. You just have to press a button and you get universal education. And the second is to enhance competition. That is, instead of there being just one monopolist in town, people can open up their own firms. The only stipulation I will make is it requires some education to open firms. So if you're uneducated, you can't open firms, but if you're educated, you can go to the bank, you can get a loan, etc. So you know how to open firms if you're educated, okay? And I'm going to argue that in this kind of setting, the status quo is very much a possibility. How do I argue this? Well, the details are obviously worked out in a model, but the idea is basically this. The middle class who can open new firms want more product market competition. They want liberalization. They love it because they can get new jobs, opening up entrepreneurial firms, and they really benefit from it. Now, the firms that they open up will also employ the uneducated. So it's not that they will not get new opportunities, but those opportunities are of lesser quality. The real good opportunities go to the middle class. The monopolist obviously hates this. He's the elite. He gets competition. He doesn't want any more competition, doesn't want to open up, doesn't want to liberalize. Now, it turns out the poor's view on this depends very much on whether they get access to universal education or they do not. If they do get access to education, they very much welcome more competition because once educated, they can also open up firms as entrepreneurs, etc., and they're very happy with that. Okay? But if they don't have education, they may have a very different view about liberalization because liberalization may create a few jobs for them, not very remunerative ones, but it substantially can increase their costs. Why is that? Because the middle class, who was earlier providing them services by, for example, providing healthcare services or services as teachers, etc., now have other opportunities. They can have substantially other jobs, and so the fees that they will charge on for healthcare will go up. the fees they will charge as teachers go up. In a sense, this is reflective of what I'm talking about in China, that the costs for the rest goes up when opportunities go up. And if some segment is not benefiting from the opportunities, they're not just indifferent, they're actually worse off. And they dislike this structure. So you would argue, well, isn't the answer obvious? Shouldn't we give the lower classes more access to education, open up education for them? The problem, however, is the middle class is very resistant to this process. The middle class have access to all the nice jobs. Why would they want more competition for this by getting the lower classes to actually get educated? Now, you might think the capitalist wants the lower classes to get educated because then he gets higher quality labor, he has a wider labor pool. But he's going to reason as follows. If I get the lower classes to become educated, they're going to join hands with the middle class and vote for more competition because that's going to be more beneficial for them. So essentially what you can get in this kind of structure with unequal endowments is status quo. Now I call this rent preservation. I call it comparative rent preservation. And why do I call it rent preservation? After all, why do the poorest of the poor have any rents? What are they preserving? Well, it turns out in an unequal society where there are limitations on everybody, everybody enjoys rents. The middle class certainly enjoys some rents because they don't have competition from the laborers who would serve as competition if they could get more education. But the lower class also has rents because the middle class has limited opportunities. So the lower class gets very cheap medical services. And those cheap medical services would go away if the middle class got better opportunities. Think of Cuba today. Cuba, the cost of healthcare is very, very low. Cubans love their country for the healthcare it provides. They may not like it for other reasons, but they love the healthcare they provide, and a lot of people go to Cuba to get health services. That's because if you're educated, you don't have a ton of opportunities in Cuba. You don't have a free market providing a variety of jobs as lawyers, as entrepreneurs, etc. And that makes medical services very cheap. And this is what I'm arguing, that as you open up, if people don't have an equal ability to take advantage of the opportunities created by reform, you could get resistance to reform. And again, across, in my view, a number of emerging markets, you've seen democracy can sometimes lead to paralysis. You see it in Philippines, for example. This is not the necessary outcome, but it is a possible outcome. And what is to prevent this paralysis? In my view, it's to start out with a condition of broader access to education, to healthcare, to a variety of other facilities. That keeps you more on an even footing, makes you see reforms from the same perspective. For example, in Italy, my sense is there would be a lot more welcoming of the kinds of reforms that are proposed by the European Union if people felt they had an equal chance when those reforms actually happened to take advantage of the fruits of reforms. But I think that in the current environment, there are very differential abilities to take advantage of these reforms. The people who are older, who have a more limited education because they left school in high school, they may not be as able to take advantage of the high-tech, IT-oriented new economy. They may be better at working with their hands and be more outcompeted by China, and in that sense be less favorable to a broader opening up than, for example, the young IT professional who thinks he or she can take on the world. So inequality, in my view, has tremendous effects. I've already given you the Chinese example. I can give you an Indian example again. The Indian example is right now comes when the government is trying to take land from farmers for industrial purposes. The large farmers are very happy with this land acquisition process because they get a lot of compensation, but you have tremendous opposition to this from the unskilled and the landless. They're very unhappy because they lose the old jobs, they're not qualified for the new ones, and in the areas where they used to live, with all this development, the cost of every service that they used to benefit from is going to go through the roof. education, healthcare, everything, because these are now developed areas. So essentially their only option is to leave the places where they used to live and go to new places where in fact things will be cheaper. The right process here, of course, is to get broader education, give people more opportunities so that they can actually take advantage of the new economy. But again, there are difficulties in this, and one can talk about that. So basically, why do I think countries are poor? I'm offering one reason. There are obviously many other reasons. I think a number of countries which we see are poor today had substantial inequality stemming from historical past. Whether it was that was the nature of populations when they were colonized, whether it was because the technology of production required large plantation economies or hacienda economies where you needed unskilled, low education workers to provide the muscle power to produce, and therefore the elite wanted to keep it that way by keeping the education levels low, or whether it was because of the disease environment which limited the extent of Europeans who went to these countries and created hierarchical societies. Whatever the reason, there were initial inequalities in the population. And my sense is these inequalities persisted and supported the policies that entrenched the inequality, policies on land, policies on education, policies on finance. And it's no surprise that with the advent of democracy, nothing much changed, because the old structures were the same as they were historically. And they essentially pushed for the same things that they had pushed for historically. There are some papers which actually establish this much more definitely. One is by Abhijit Banerjee and Lakshmi Iyer, who look at the structure of land holdings in India. And they show that places that were historically had very concentrated land holdings because of the way the land settlement occurred at that time, are places where you had very little investment in social goods, in public goods like education, and which are now the states which are relatively backward in India, which haven't grown as much. Similarly, with a colleague from the former colleague from the IMF, we've done a study in the United States, looking across a number of states, looking at land concentration in the United States in the early part of the 20th century. That was a time when rural areas were very, very important, and the rural vote was important. And we find that areas that were more concentrated in terms of land holdings typically tended to have far fewer banks. And the effect of this kind on financial structure, and the argument there is landlords preferred it that way because by limiting the access of their tenants to finance, they could squeeze them on other margins, including, for example, the goods that they bought from the local shop, which is often controlled by the landlord himself. There is evidence of this sort that we unearth, but we also show that this had persistent effects, that into the late 20th century, the effects of the land holdings and their negative effect on banking patterns affected growth in manufacturing right till the late 20th century. And what broke this was really a change in technology, not a change in the political structures in that area. And what do I mean by technology? The information technology revolution made it much harder for a particular area to control the financial services that people had access to by controlling the number of banks in that area. Because you could now bank across states, it became much more feasible, and you can date the kind of breakdown of the old structures to the development of technology and the reforms as a result. So that's, let me, how much, maybe 5 minutes to conclude. Let me talk about what the implications of this kind of thing are. It's basically saying that a lot of people, including organizations like mine in the past, the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank, used to think that reforms were just a matter of selling the ideas to the people. You go to a poor country and you say, this is what you're doing badly, and here's how you do it properly, and then it was a question of those guys basically enacting it. But we always heard back from the countries that this was politically difficult, that it was not possible, that if they did implement it, people wouldn't follow through. And it wasn't something that was fully internalized by the multilateral financial institutions, because they said, well, you know, it seems obvious that this is going to increase growth and welfare. Why don't you do it? And if there are problems, you know, there'll be some surplus left over to redistribute to those who've been made worse off. Well, that redistribution never gets done, and so it's very hard to get consensus within a number of these countries for reform paths. And a lot of it gets stymied even before it starts. It gets blocked. And I think the reasons are precisely that even for obvious reforms, not everyone is better off. And a substantial number of people, in fact, can be worse off, especially those who don't have access, which typically in some of these countries are the majority of the people. So even if they were democratic, I think precisely because they're democratic in some countries, the politicians that the multilateral institutions talk to hear the voice of the people and therefore are reluctant to actually espouse these reforms. So broadly speaking, what we would argue for is you also need to fix the other elements in society. You need to spread the endowments more widely, spread access to education, to higher quality education, spread access to healthcare, spread access to governance. You need to do all those things in order to get more consensus on reforms. That has to be part and parcel. Of course, the problems in doing that are not inconsequential. There are vested interest groups that benefit from the way things are and would also get hurt if you spread access. So ultimately, it comes down to why do reforms take place? In my view, a lot of it is either because people haven't noticed that these reforms could eventually have the effect they have, or because you have, by luck, the right sort of political coalition at the right place, or sometimes simply because the outside world, in a sense, makes it attractive to reform, breaks the status quo. I think one of the reasons the world economy has expanded so much and reforms have been substantial in the last 35 years is because we've had the outside world expand for a number of countries, making it attractive for them to undertake reforms within their own country. So the whole point of this book that I wrote, Saving Capitalism from the Capitalists, was to argue that in a sense, what made the capitalists go to support reforms rather than protect their own turf and protect the size of the pie that they had was that the outside world created tremendous opportunities over the last 35 years, which made it attractive for them to reform. And I think that's been one important reason why a number of countries have reformed. I will, in the interest of time, skip over some issues. Let me just add that it seems to me a large part of the Asian miracle and why the Asian miracle has not been replicated in Latin America has to do with the fact that some of the Asian countries that worked very well, Taiwan, Korea, Japan, focused very early on endowment enhancing reforms, land reform and education reforms. And that created the underlying conditions for reform to have support as they went through. Similarly, China, in my view, has had the benefit of having fairly widespread education to begin with, which has allowed a lot more support for reform. And I think their concerns now, as these inequalities increase, is very much well placed because it could act eventually to suppress reforms. So the bottom line, I think I want to argue, are reforms are difficult. And some people argue that economists don't even know what reforms to undertake. Bill Easterly is a prominent supporter of this view. I'm not so pessimistic. I think economists actually do know something, and we have some ability to say what makes sense. But the reforms that make sense may not have broad political support because they will leave some segments worse off. And it's very hard for many societies to undertake the kind of bargains that are necessary to convince the people who are going to be made worse off that this is not a permanent state of affairs. And as a result, there is opposition, and often democracy becomes the way this opposition gets expressed. It's not democracy itself is a problem. Democracy sometimes can be the solution, but I'm arguing that democracy is, in a sense, not an answer to all this by itself. It needs the underlying conditions in society, and improving access is often an important part of how you improve the underlying conditions.
Bene, allora ringraziamo. Ecco, Rajan è stato efficace e sintetico.
Well, thank you very much. When I introduced the subjects you'll touch upon, I forgot to tell people what you do. You have been a professor at the University of Chicago. You have been an economic advisor and director at the International Monetary Fund. So this is it. So, oh, no, we would like to entertain some questions. And are there any questions from the floor?
A student of economics, and I wanted to know about how would you finance those equalizing reforms in countries that are poor? I guess those are costly reforms. Thank you.
It's a very good question. I'm not sure I agree with the idea that they're particularly costly given the benefits. For example, education. I can see from my own country, India, that the biggest sort of barrier to widespread education is really the power of vested interests. On the primary education side, it's the government teachers. And interestingly, this is something that is quite universal. The problem there is that many of these teachers essentially have 2 or 3 jobs. The attendance rate in schools for these government teachers is approximately 50%. On any day you go and show up at the school, 50% of the teachers are actually teaching. I take that back. 50% of the teachers are actually there. Of the 50% who are actually there, it turns out that only 50% of the time they're actually teaching. The rest of the time they're doing something else. So it's a very pathetic state of affairs, and comes from the fact that these are very powerful groups that, as one politician tells me, these are the guys who man the election booths during the election. And as a result, you don't want to cross them. But I think the point really is that you have private school teachers who are paid 1/4 the rate that these public school teachers are paid, and always are showing up much more frequently. People are hungry for an education, and they're willing to pay the private school rates, even though they're very poor, because they feel in that process they can get the kids out of poverty. But it is a travesty that in a poor country, so much is spent by the government on trying to ensure public education, but the public education system doesn't respond. This is not to say that there's a blanket indictment of public education. Public education systems in some other countries work very well. But it is to say that in India, the problem doesn't seem to be money. It seems to be trying to get the system to provide what it's supposed to provide. Okay? So in that sense, I don't think capital is really the problem. In fact, I've sort of moved to a somewhat extreme view on the role of capital in development. To my mind, with the right policies, with the right structures, you will always find capital. The problem is you don't have the right policies, you don't have the right structures, therefore capital is not available. And when we try and thrust capital down people's throat, when you have the wrong policies, the wrong structures, you make things worse. That's to some extent my view of the whole aid debate also, that aid hasn't proven, if you look across countries, hasn't proven particularly useful. And my sense is because the real problem is you don't make the adjustments in those countries commensurate with utilizing the capital appropriately.
Altre domande? Prego.
Thank you. One thing which is interesting is that sometimes those vested interests you are discussing, that as you argued they are coming from essentially an unequal distribution or endowment of resources at the beginning somehow historically. Sometimes they also develop through ways of creating some more equality. I'm thinking, for example, the vested interest of the unions, of the labor systems that you have in the West and the industrialized world, that are more and more affected by the new waves of globalization and the insecurity that this is creating. No? So in a way, what we're looking at is a process of transition of institutions. And sometimes these institutions have had a role of spreading the endowments and essentially distributing wealth in the growth process to several parts of the society. And these very parts that have been endowed by these redistributions or benefited from these redistributions now somehow are against further redistribution. So I think it's an interesting, even you can read also, if you want, the transition from the planned economies into market economies. You can read it this way. I mean, in a way, all the communist ways was a way of redistributing resources in principle. No? And essentially created the vested interest that prevented then the entry of market forces again or something like that. So it's really what creates this unequal endowment, or these endowments that prevent reforms can come from very different patterns in a way.
I think that's absolutely right. That and in a sense, I want to take you further. I want to ask, you hinted at something which I think may actually be, which is an initial force for redistribution can actually be a good force if you can remove the vested interest that sort of, focus only on redistribution. Why is Vietnam such a capitalist economy nowadays? I mean, yes, there's a communist party in charge, etc. But if you walk the streets of Hanoi, everybody's a capitalist. And everybody says Vietnam is the new China. Well, China was the old China. And you look at the countries of Eastern Europe, how they have taken to a market economy, even though they've had the institutions of communism for 30, 40 years. Overnight, they can vanish. So unleashing that pressure or taking away those constraints can be very useful if you've got a relatively equal society. But of course, those things can come back. I think one of the big problems in Russia is the fact that so much wealth is concentrated in a few hands. But not just that, it's that it's perceived as having come about illegitimately, which then gives the oligarchs very little political power to support property rights because their own property is suspect. Similarly, you mentioned the idea of unions. Well, unions can be a very strong force and were a very strong force towards broader education, better healthcare, and so on. And they can be a very good force. But of course, when you get inequalities as emerge over time, they can be a reactionary force also. So you're absolutely right. I've taken for granted the inequalities. But where the inequalities come from, very important, and how do you reduce them? Sometimes the forces that reduced inequality in the past can be forces that prevent it from reducing in the future. Gentleman here.
Just 5 minutes for two big questions, but just to ask you if you think about the Italian case, which is very interesting because, as you know, Italian economy is so-called dual economy, north and south. And in this case, I think, I was just thinking about this when you were speaking, the Indian case and so on. I think that there is that we have many troubles in democracy because of this inequality. The big one is north and south of Italy. And this is really impairing the democratic process. For instance, the middle class of South Italy does really want reforms, because they will lose. You know, we say, clientes. So really, they don't really agree in this process of reforms. Well, this is a big question not to speak about in a few minutes, but another question, I don't know if you, in your book, considered about is the role of religion in this process. Because, you know, Max Weber studied about Hinduism and Confucianism and Buddhism, comparing as far as they were concerned with economic development. I mean, it's a very, very important factor.
Lasciamo rispondere.
Yes.
Okay, grazie. Altrimenti è una domanda troppo lunga.
So the question is too long, so we'll let our speaker answer.
Good questions. I mean, north and south of Italy. Well, I wish my friend Luigi Zingales was here to respond. He has strong views on this. I mean, I don't know enough Italian history. I do know that at some point the Normans were responsible for setting up large feudal estates in the south, and whether it's the same story that the large feudal estates created a different culture, so to speak, economic culture from the north is an important question. But you're absolutely right that that division creates very different attitudes towards the reform process because people benefit very differently. And it's no good to say, well, the pie is bigger, we can make you transfers, because the transfer is not going to take place. Plus, who wants handouts? Why does the South always want handouts from the North? It's not going to accept that. So really, it seems to me that if this were the case, and again, I plead ignorance of Italian conditions and history, if this were the case, the real answer will be to upgrade the institutions in southern Italy so that it can actually benefit from the reform process. But that's going to be much harder than just saying it. It's extremely difficult, and you know, you're fighting against history, so to speak. That said, I am very resistant to the notion that culture is unchangeable. And you know, I remember a book, Milton Friedman's book on Free to Choose, which has a piece, a sentence there about this American who went to Japan and basically has the comment that this is in the late 19th century, before the tremendous change, and says the Japanese are a lazy people, and because they're lazy are unlikely to achieve much. You can find the same comment made about the South Koreans, and nobody today would say the South Koreans are lazy. I'm sure you'll find the same comment made about Indians. In fact, I think there are a lot of similarity on some dimensions with the caricature of Indians and caricature of Italians. Maybe that's why I like Italians so much. But the idea sometimes is that Indians are very reluctant to be on time. There's something called Indian Standard Time, which is 2 hours after every event is supposed to start. That's when the Indian shows up. That's changing. That's changed overnight in Bombay. Today, I mean, I go 10 minutes late for a meeting in Bombay and I feel apologetic. And people on the other side expect me to be apologetic because they started on time. So the culture is changing, and I'm sure the culture in the North has changed when the economic need has changed. So to that extent, I believe that when the economic structures change in southern Italy, they will, in fact, prompt the need for quote-unquote cultural change. And so I don't think that's irredeemable. Which then leads to your question on religion. I mean, again, I am resistant to the idea that there is a Protestant ethic. To my mind, you know, no religion says, even Hinduism doesn't say be fatalistic, don't do anything. There are versions of Hinduism which basically says you have the duty to work very hard. You know, part of your duty is to fulfill your role in society. So I think to some extent, religions also change as and when, or maybe not the underlying philosophy, but how it's interpreted changes as the economic environment changes. So I don't think there's permanence in these cultural and religious concerns.
Yeah, good evening. I would just like to have your comment on the term democracy. I think democracy is not really free. What do you think? Is it more controlled democracy because of all the institutions that come and the bureaucratization also of democracy? I just want to have your comment on this.
That's a deep question. Is democracy free? I mean, if you mean, is everybody's vote equal? I don't think it is, for sure. Some people have far more influence, and rightly so. Some people are intellectual leaders and can influence a lot of people. Some people are rabble-rousers. In the United States, you have some people on TV who essentially can command a huge audience and can say simply awful things, but get a lot of people to believe them. So, you know, ideas matter, even wrong ideas, and money matters, and more money, better. I mean, part of Obama's success is he's raised more money, much more money than Hillary, and probably will raise much more money than McCain. So now, I think these things matter. The real question is, are we getting something which is totally against the wishes of the people? And I think with a moderate, I think democracy, the one share, one vote, can tolerate a fair amount of problems like this and still produce an outcome which broadly represents the views of the people. So in that sense, I think many democracies are quite free. So let me leave it at that.
Sì, volevo dire che potete fare anche domande in italiano, non c'è problema. Se...
Indeed, you can ask questions in Italian, for we have a translation service.
When you talk about endowments, you talk about land and human capital. But how about the liquidity constraints? A lot of people don't go to school because they cannot afford it. So you talk about human capital and land, and the consequence is government reforms. But how about the financial sector? Do they play a role in this inequality?
I think it does. Actually, my list of broadening access included finance. If I didn't say that, sorry. Yeah, I think finance, education, healthcare, and also a safety net for old age. I think those are important factors in promoting a better growth and better attitudes towards growth. One of the big problems in the United States right now is the perception that even the middle class is being shut out of good quality higher education, that the cost of college has gone up so much that a middle class family cannot afford it. And the reaction to that in the United States has been that a number of schools with large endowments have announced that they won't charge fees of people even with incomes that are middle class. So, you know, typically they used to say, go get finance. Everybody can get access to finance in the United States, should not be a problem. But increasingly, even that is being questioned. And they are actually reducing fees, some of these Ivy League schools. Princeton, for example, you get admission, or Harvard, you get admission, that should be enough to pay your way through college.
My question is about the model you described before. And what about all the other benefits for poor people that not depends on their access to extraction? I mean low prices for the goods produced by the ex-monopolist and more goods produced, and so they can also choose the quality and so on.
That's a very good point. That's in the model, that there are benefits from the reforms. And the real question is, when do the benefits get outweighed by the costs? The benefits, as you point out, are cheaper goods being produced, now that the inefficient monopolist no longer controls everything, more variety, if you will, a whole lot of other things like that. And the basic idea of the model is to provide conditions under which the costs outweigh the benefits. And typically that happens when this other's good, which is inelastically supplied, is produced very inefficiently. And therefore the price for that goes up a lot when you have reforms. And typically I have in mind non-traded goods where the world market cannot provide. And so local goods such as medical care, education.
Preferisco parlare in italiano.
So I prefer to speak Italian. I have a non-technical question. Do you think it would be necessary and also mandatory for people like you to try and get in touch with other persons like you to try and give an example for the first time in this history of people who through their own knowledge are willing to do good and to give back trust in persons or to persons who are much more knowledgeable than the man in the street, so that the man in the street can perceive that people like you can find solutions, even technical solutions, which are generally difficult to find. So that would be like what used to be in the past the role of intellectuals from many different disciplines, which were spontaneously formed in Europe and maybe also in your country. Today, we really need that many brains could join forces in order to do the common good. That would be advisable to translate into practice the knowledge that you have acquired through your efforts, so that you can show the citizens that you are not confined in academic circles.
Again, very good point. I mean, that's precisely what conferences like this are for. And I would hope that's what somebody like Paul Krugman writes books for, that the real idea is to translate what we do in papers that nobody reads to the larger public and say, look, here are ways that we can possibly think of ways forward. I really think it's very important for economists to communicate with the wider public. I think that should be one of their important roles. And I think part of the real problem is that most solutions in economics are difficult. And as soon as you say on the one hand, on the other, you've lost most of the public. And that leaves the territory for politicians who can just forget about saying on the one hand, on the other, and offer simplistic solutions which often are not right. So what we need is a public also that is more tolerant of the debate. And we need economists to go a little beyond what they can prove in their classroom and on the blackboard and say, well, I need to go beyond this to convince people, and I'm willing to take a stance on this which may not be perfectly supported by the data as yet. I know it's not wrong, I think it's right, but I haven't proven it, and it may be very hard to prove, but because I'm talking with the public and because it can affect public policy, I'm willing to go beyond. I think there are very few economists who feel comfortable doing that. And I think we need more people who can say, here's where the sort of level of knowledge lies, but it's not enough to answer the question that you've asked me. And the question or the policy question requires a leap. But I'm willing to make that leap based on my broad understanding. Often we don't make that leap, we stay, and because we're not willing to make that leap, we stay in our study in the ivory tower. But increasingly, I'm hopeful that more people will make that leap and inform the policy debate. And I think you're absolutely right. We should be part of that debate.
Chiudiamo? Sì? Se non ci sono altre domande possiamo concludere il nostro incontro.
Sorry, there is another question. No, everything right? No, there are no other questions. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, Rajan. Thank you. And goodbye.